Welcome back to my reading of An Empire Divided. If you haven't caught this, we've been going through a massive lore document that establishes the setting of the region of Canthan. Considering that there's a Guild Wars 2 expansion scheduled to hit this area of the world at some point going forwards, I thought I should finally read this out to you guys. It's a brilliant piece, and through no point over all my time making YouTube videos covering this franchise have I ever really sat down. So in this part, we're going to be continuing talking about the timeline, but I thought I'd open up with something kind of cool. Since we've been playing factions itself and exploring Canthan along with these videos, I wanted to show you guys this area. So we're in the Ferndale of the Echo-Vowed Forest, a location we're probably all familiar with, a forest made of stone. The Empire Divided we'll talk about more soon. But I just kind of wanted to show you some of the really captivating landscapes and environment shots that you can actually get out of this place, especially since the 2018 graphics overhaul in Guild Wars 1 that pushes the draw distance further out. So this is actually an area of the Echo-Vowed Forest that I found really captivating, and that's because the tops of the trees have all been blown off. The devs never really explained this or went into much detail. Was it the Jade Wind that did it? But it's pretty incredible, right? As the dredge attacked me. And just to give you a bit of a contrast there to the forest with no canopy versus the forest with a canopy, this is what it looks like elsewhere when the trees actually extend way up. Guild Wars 2 can do some really interesting stuff here. I'm sure the devs won't want to do the whole region just like this. A green, verdant forest of this scale with leaves everywhere up at the top. Maybe this kind of location we've got here at the Ferndale, we will see re-implemented and represented in the sequel somehow. So anyway, let's get over to the timeline. When we last left off, we were dealing with the year 46 of the Canthan calendar, and we were talking about Lord Emperor Canthan, who basically left the world at this point. They do this story about him falling from his horse, which you guys in the comments were really amazing about. Supposedly, this is like quite an obvious reference to, was it Genghis Khan basically had a situation like this in his later years? But the devs are basically borrowing something from the real world here. And wherever you guys spot that and I don't spot interesting references, please let me know and I'll fill them in the later videos. So we move along with this event of Yanzo's two sisters that just left. We've never really heard anything about them. Whether they'll factor into a Guild Wars 2 story or something is a nice idea, and I'm sure some people are excited about that. But another thing I do want to be clear about, what we're reading here is a little bit removed from the game. It's all canon, and it all definitely fed into what we experienced in factions, but it was not as front and center as maybe this video series is now going to give you the impression of. So I actually personally rate some of these more obscure pieces of information, like these sisters, to be less likely to appear as a thing in Guild Wars 2. I think there's more prominent story steps that the devs can really wrestle with that were very obviously there in-game. Like stuff to do with the Envoys and the Celestials and so on. And just the nature of it as the Dragon Empire, how that might relate to the Deep Sea Dragon and so on. I've been playing so much factions lately and getting so enthusiastic about all this lore. The idea of suddenly pairing it with an Elder Dragon is getting really captivating to me because they feel like such disparate elements of this universe. So, the year 48. After decades of unsuccessful conflict, the Luxon tribes themselves united into a true nation only 2 years after Canthan's death. According to their legends, this was due to renewed aggression from the Canthans. Under Canthan, the Empire had reached a peaceful pact with both of the less developed cultures with which Canthan shared a continent, making the Kurzik and Luxon peoples subjects of the Emperor. When Yanzo began a bloody campaign to quell what he called an insurgency in the Luxon territories and slaughtered hundreds of Luxon elders in grand public executions, the tribes finally decided enough was enough. They formally declared themselves to be the Luxon nation and attempted to secede from the Empire of the Dragon. What you guys might not be really remembering about Guild Wars 1, but the Luxons, you know, they're brawlers, they're brutes, they're pirates, they're rough and tumble. And so, while the Kurziks, you know, might have been easier to subjugate to a certain degree, these guys were always going to be a little bit restless, and they were always going to be prone to being antagonized, especially with this idea of these grand executions. Again, just this tone and this sense of this franchise and the world building here. You know, thinking of a bunch of people getting hung by the noose or whatever in grand public executions. Guild Wars 2 doesn't really feel like it goes into this area, not even with the more aggressive cultures that we inhabit the world with up north now 250 years ago that probably could be doing stuff like this. The devs just never really shine a light on it. So, though the true secession proved impossible for the Luxons to win, they did eventually gain a new status as a vassal state, independent to a point, but still technically part of the Empire. It is believed that this, perhaps more than any other reason, is why the Luxons turned their ire on the Kurzik neighbours in the Ekavald Forest. That rivalry's never subsided, and even today the borders between the two are marked with frequent skirmishes and bloodshed. I'm not sure I really think they laid this out well enough, because yeah, if they've created this story where these people are being subjugated and brought into a fold that they don't really believe in, surely that predisposes them to ally and take on, you know, the city and to take on the empire itself rather than fighting amongst themselves. But there's also this angle that they're a little bit primitive to a certain degree, whether that really lingers 250 years later. Sorry, not 250 years later, or, you know, many years, to be honest here, 1,200 years later. By the time we're playing it in Guild Wars 1, or just 1,000 years, is another question. So you have 51cc. Like the Luxons before them, the Kurziks were likely driven to unity by the belligerence of the new emperor. Yanzo was his father's son when it came to strategy, intelligence, horsemanship, and progeny. Like Canthan, Yanzo had several dozen children by his many concubines, children who carried the blood of the emperor, but no claim to the throne according to the Canthan mores and values. His temper, however, was legendarily short, and he brutally put down a relatively small Kurzik uprising early in this year. This, coupled with the new threat of a unified Luxon state in the sea to the east, led directly to Kurzik unity. I love this reference as the Luxon state as a sea to the east, because that is so bizarre to realize that all the stories we're talking about, this isn't just like a flat plain. The Kurziks are like pirate people that live on these little islands and, you know, cling to the coastlines. It almost makes it seem like the Kurziks, you know, they have real territory and real resource and real space. The Luxons don't necessarily, but then this is a fantasy franchise where they can become, you know, preeminent seafarers and sort of live on their great ark ships and so on. And you don't really realize that until the article directly calls reference to it. And it's especially important when we think about Guild Wars 2, because that might be the state of affairs 250 years later, as large chunks of this sea might have reverted back to water. It's the Luxon sea state. So we don't really get a clear idea of them unifying, because obviously this is like an in-universe document that is a little bit waffly on the details, but I like that, it adds to its authenticity. Belligerent and brutal though he may have been, even Lord Emperor Yanzo was unable to drive the Kurziks from the Ekavald. They knew the forest far too well. This is very similar to like the Druids and the Shining Blade, I guess, even in the Maguma jungle to the north, and the White Mantle trying to kick them out, but they just can't, the guerrilla tactics and so on. He was able to contain them within those loose borders, however, and soon was convinced by sage advisors to arrive at much the same arrangement that had been forged with the Luxons. The Kurziks too became a vassal state. Unlike their neighbours, they remained much more isolated, which, in my interpretation, is a driving force behind the intense competition between the Kurziks' houses for domination within their own unique political structure. I really like the way that this article takes care to make these people feel distinct, because you're essentially introducing two vassal states at once that are kind of the same story. Neither of them like the Empire, they're fighting one another. So you really have to draw attention to where they're different and why they're different. And I think they do that really convincingly here. I love the idea of the Kurziks being extra isolationist. And in fact, when you get in game and you play through the faction storyline, you see certain elements of this shining through. Like when Danica comes to you as a Kurzik that wants to fight against the plague, she's kind of a weirdo for doing that, because most of the Kurziks are content to hide in their giant tree-sized cathedrals and so on, and just contemplate issues rather than take decisive action. The fact that Danica leaves and actually comes to the city is a really big thing that, if you don't read The Empire Divided, you kind of don't get that added context, and the devs can only do so much with the quest text. Guild Wars 2, the Kurziks aren't necessarily any different. Just because this becomes a regular forest again, as it was during all this stuff we're reading in An Empire Divided, they could still be isolationist. They could still have the, you know, those elements of their culture going forward. And I know what a lot of you guys are going to say. You're going to say it's been 250 years, they could have changed a lot. And I totally agree that if they have changed a lot, that would be totally authentic, and I wouldn't be against that in any way. But I would be against it on the grounds that this, as an artificially constructed idea for a setting right now, works. It's cool to have this kind of people. Guild Wars 2 doesn't really look at this way of living very much and could do something interesting. So if I were writing this and if I was to have expectations I were excited about, I'd actually like to see that they haven't changed that much. And kind of similar for the Luxons, but then again, these guys do feel very Norny in certain ways, and we have already got a lot of pirate stuff. We've got all of, you know, the Blood Tide stuff and everything up at launch with Lion's Arch. And then we've just had an expansion that deals a lot with Corsairs. Maybe I could see some really cool justifications for changing up the format when it comes to Luxons. In fact, a really interesting dimension the devs could go with is I think many of us are expecting these guys to still be fighting or something. Maybe that's not the case at all. Maybe it will be like a unified front against the city, an us versus them kind of thing. And we would have a factions situation again, where we once again ally with one or the other. But it's not Kurziks and Luxons. It's the vassal states versus the city. Especially since, as you'll see as we go through some of this lore in the coming weeks and months, it looks like really the Dragon Empire itself might be set to be the antagonist after the Ministry of Purity and so on becomes a thing. But we'll get to all of that. Right now, we're not even at Guild Wars 1's time. So, let's move on. We're now many years ahead. That's a big jump, guys. 51cc to 305. This is a 250-year gap, just as Guild Wars 1 into Guild Wars 2 is a 250-year gap. So think about all the changes that they enacted between the two games. And yeah, a lot of the, you know, geographical changes and stuff, they kind of hand wave and say is Elder Dragon stuff, which weren't elements of the world at this point. But still, it's a big jump. Though the news would not arrive in the Empire of the Dragon for several decades after the fact, the year 305, by Canthan reckoning, saw the arrival of the humans on the continent of Tyria. When news of these primitive barbarians did eventually reach Cantha, it was considered of little consequence. Perhaps, if the Canthas had seen fit to drive north and expand their empire, history would have played out very differently. But with the concerns and needs of an already sprawling realm, the emperors of Cantha chose to remain within their borders, and so the various Tyrian cultures developed unhindered by, and for the most part, unaware of their southern neighbors. Now this is a fascinating entry for so many reasons. First, the parallel to the Canthans of Guild Wars 2, who also in general have chosen to focus on themselves. You know, maybe the Kurziks have influenced the greater nations more than people realize. And that's kind of the big thing that the devs are relying on right now when we sort of explain the state of Guild Wars 2 as it is. There's no Zaitan, barring sea travel. There's no real reason we couldn't go there. And there's no reason they couldn't come here. So why haven't they? Well, the concerns and needs of an already sprawling realm. So they're choosing to remain within their borders. That might change by the end of the Icebrood saga. I've always been really excited by the idea of an expansion or a Living World season or now a saga ending with a sudden 180 weird WTF moment where you're in the middle of some big story, you happen to be near a coastline, and you sort of look out to the water in the middle of some intense moment. You can imagine whatever that is, probably to do with an Elder Dragon. And suddenly you just see a fleet of ships on the horizon. And it's like, what the hell? Who are they? What's going on? And you realize that they're from the Dragon Empire. And then it like cuts to credits and it's like, okay, cool. We got an expansion coming. I've always thought that'd be really exciting. The day that the Canthans decide, no, they are coming north. And that would kind of align with some of the other elements we got from Guild Wars 1, but also not really, because the Ministry of Purity was really about, I don't know, xenophobia and isolationism to a certain degree. The other reason this is fascinating is to look at the humans' entry point to the world, because the idea being we are all aliens as humans. We were brought here by the gods, and especially in Guild Wars 2, you'll see this a lot. The idea is we were brought down to Ur, and we spread out from Ur. But here, it's like, well, hold on, we were chilling out and doing things for 305 years. And then when the gods came to Ur and dropped them on Tyria, they were primitive barbarians, according to the Canthans, who didn't even hear about it for several decades. So what is that? There's two separate moments where humans arrived on Tyria. Certainly one where the gods brought us here at Ur, But what about this other one, where the Canthans got here, and the Kurziks and the Luxons, and that had happened so much earlier? Why had that happened earlier? Was that the result of the gods too? We obviously heard in a previous episode of the Empire Divided that the Canthans had an idea of the gods already before this event, 305 years into their calendar. So they'd obviously had some interaction, but this is like a whole other dimension to the origin of humans, that you've kind of got, like, not just the fact we're aliens, but like there were twin events at least. And I find that fascinating. I don't know whether ArenaNet ever really wrestled with exactly what details they've got and have found a way to put it into a cohesive storyline. But I'd love it if the expansion finds a way to. Like, these are the difficult things that their world builders and their story writers have to actually wrestle with, I think. They have to figure out what are the facts, because what the community thinks they know is often very much drifted from what the actual facts they've given are, and that's something I fall prey to a lot as well. ArenaNet needs to know exactly what their canon is, and then have the confidence to manipulate that canon into a way that makes it really fun. I'd love to see them do that, because that's where I think they have the hardest job, and that's what I'm most excited about. That's the kind of thing they really had to figure out, like with the Cormyr scene in Path of Fire. And there's going to be a lot of moments in this Canthan expansion that are kind of equivalent to that Cormyr moment. So, what a great little section there. Moving forward, we're up to the year 509, another massive jump of 200 years here. 204. The gods of Tyria are known to have walked the land relatively recently, and not just on the northern continent. The same gods also visited Cantha and were worshipped there alongside the spirits of Cantha's ancestors. But it was not until the Canthan year 509 that the gods granted humans to the north, south, and parts beyond the gift of true magic. Before this spectacular event, what Canthans called magic was actually just power granted by their ancestors' spirits, a practice which continues to this day with the ritualists. The gift of magic altered the practice of ritualists very little. If anything, it only made their abilities more powerful than before. So we already did a discussion on this on a previous episode of An Empire Divided. I'd recommend you go back to that. I won't rehash all of that. But again, the idea here that the gods only really started significantly interacting with the Canthans, or at all maybe, is that what they're going for? Being so many years later, really raises direct questions as to what the humans were doing here if they had a separate thing going on. You know, in terms of, did they evolve here on their own? I mean, there's so many cool theories. I think once upon a time I did a Guild Wars Mysteries episode about the origin of the humans, or at least I was slated to do one, and it was basically about these topics. The year 510, just 1 year later, only a year after giving magic to humanity, the gods, for reasons that are not yet completely understood, left the mortal realm for good. They did not abandon humans to their fates, however. Monks maintained a spiritual link to the gods. Balthazar, Lissa, Dwayna, Melandru, and Grenth continue to hear prayers and grant blessings to those mortals who seek them out. But the days when God and man spoke face to face were over. So, we'll finish this whole section. Many have hypothesized that the lack of historical data concerning the supernatural event is the work of the gods themselves, who do not wish humans to know where they went or why. At the risk of blasphemy, I support this assertion. The gods certainly must have had their reasons, but whatever those reasons, they did not share them with humans. Not even the much more complete and detailed histories of Cantha can say for certain why the gods departed, only that they did. Right, now this one's amazing as well, because it's actually setting up mysteries that the devs did go back and answer in large part. So I'll draw at this very quickly. Monks maintained a spiritual link to the gods. Only monks? That's a weird thing for the Empire Divided to really talk about. Of course, in terms of game mechanics, any profession, even up from, you know, the year 510 CC to all the way up till Guild Wars 1's actual playable stuff, like right here in game, hundreds of years later, I can interact with the gods. I can go to the Xinku corridor. I can kneel at a statue. The avatar will be there. Like, they are kind of interacting still at this point. They only go truly hands-off towards the end of Guild Wars 1. And that's where we end up in where we are in Guild Wars 2, where humans are really losing their faith and so on. Which kind of has done a U-turn now because of the events of Path of Fire and Balthazar coming back. But nonetheless, the idea here that it was only monks that were maintaining a link really feels like very much an in-universe idea that the devs never emphasized after this point, but I think is pretty cool. Anyway, the idea that gods were walking amongst them, Guild Wars 2, and obviously a lot of the information as we've gone forward has really gone to clarify this, that the gods were living on Tyria before this point, but they were kind of living in Or. They were living at Ara, which was way up north. So to what extent did the Canthans know that the gods were living amongst them? That's a great question, and I'm not really sure whether the expansion will talk about it. It also doesn't gel very well with this information we had up here about how they didn't really care about the northern areas because they were far away. Well, surely they would have cared if that's where the gods were living, surely. But, you know, history, as they say, is history. So what I'll also finally go on with is this idea that they're really saying, for reasons that are not understood, why they left the mortal realm, and that, you know, the gods themselves were hiding this information. This is stuff that clearly inspired the team with the very next campaign, Nightfall, which pretty much answered massive questions about this year and this moment. When the magic was taken away again, the answer would ultimately be revealed to be there was another god called Abaddon, and they went to war with him and ended up imprisoning him and then buggered off. So most of it was answered, and it's really cool to see in this like fairly removed article about Guild Wars 1 that they really did set up some deeper lore. They breadcrumbed this, and one campaign later they answered it. It's kind of amazing, and it's a unique for this franchise, I would say, to a certain degree, because obviously we only had Nightfall and then they moved on to Guild Wars 2. A discussion I thoroughly covered in a different video this week. So I think this doesn't actually set up much for Guild Wars 2 at this point, really. I think it was more about Nightfall, and I think they did things fairly satisfyingly. The only last wriggle is, what are the gods doing now? Like, whatever they're doing, that's still definitely on our minds, and relates to that Cormier scene I was mentioning just a moment ago. So that's year 510, and of course we will continue on. We're going to talk about the Age of the Bat and 511. This is now at the time where the Tyrian, the Mavelian calendar up in Tyria has started. So 511 years later, finally Tyrians are starting to do big and interesting things. The war with the Char and stuff is going on, and I'm sure we'll have lots of interesting insights as we go on. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Let me know what you think. I'll see you for more Empire Divided as we move forward.